All right, so welcome everybody to this week's Lore Call. It's January the 29th. This week we're going to be talking about the Glacian War. It will be happening in two parts, this conversation, because the war happened in two parts, more or less. Um, the Empire, it came out for a little while. Glacia was a threat, but then due to Thup's trickery, she was more or less subjugated, but um, her presence still remained in one way or another. So we'll talk about this in two parts. Today we're going to be talking about, again, kind of that first conflict and then the peace that followed through the Second Era. But before we get into those, really we need to talk about the meaning of the war, right? What is it all about? Um, Glacia was the first being to emerge on Atheros, and as such, she thinks that she has dominion over the entire land. So all the other avatars, all of the other races, they're all subject to her. They are all her slaves, and they should be willing slaves. What's more, um, so the root then of the war, and even when Glacia isn't an active threat, right? Because again, during the time of peace, we still have some intervening conflict happening. But really, the true meaning of the war is on Atheros. It's a conflict between those who believe in self-governance and those who do not. Those who believe in self-determination and those who do not. It's basically forces of imposed order, represented by Glacia or by Veshta, against forces of natural order, represented by Kane, represented by the Bork. But then you also have forces of chaos thrown in there as well, such as Ahuahitaroa and the Karlak as well. To most people, though, if you were to walk up in the world of Atheros to somebody and you were to ask them what was the war all about, they wouldn't give you that complicated scholar's answer. They would say it was about slavery. The Empire wanted slaves, Revaks wants slaves, and they would take the slaves wherever they could find them. And of course, the free people of the land had to defend themselves against these attacks by the Empire. So that's really like the root meaning of the war. It's that idea of self-governance and self-determination, and that there's forces on Atheros who believe that people should rule themselves, and there's others that think that others should be subservient to them. So that conflict is really, again, the root of the war. So diving then into history. Glacia is one of the, again, she's the oldest thing on Atheros. And the Frost Raiders are the oldest race. But they didn't start going to war for a couple thousand years after they were formed. So for the first couple thousand years, from about 6,000 First Era to 4,000 First Era, Glacia was content to simply have the Bruk, the Frost Giants, work the mines and bring her metal and bring her gems and bring her rare objects and add to her grandeur and her treasury. She was fine with that. But then about 4,000 First Era, she heard about these other races, specifically the Thup. They seemed rather small and squishy. Sure, they had their magic, but that was nothing compared to the might of the Bruk. So she ordered the Bruk to begin researching weaponsmithing, especially great weaponsmithing, and they became masters of weaponsmithing. She formed a group of raiders, an order called the Frost Raiders, from their number, from the preeminent warriors of each tribe, and she marched them down there to the south from Barlak to kind of like the Thup's little halcyon area there in the southwestern horseshoe plains. This was before the mountains and the hills kind of separated it all. And I mean, for lack of a better word, she conquered them. She utterly subjugated them. She showed them a what pain was, I guess. The old story that we told around the table was that the first Thup who died in the campaign was called Squish. That was his name, and also the sound he made when the frost giant squished him with a big club. And that was pretty much the only show of force the Thup needed. Like they literally lived in like a halcyon era, right? Like they didn't know death, they didn't know pain. All they knew was joy and laughter. And sometimes, sure, they would play like pranks and tricks on each other, but there's nothing malevolent there. You know, it's just out of a brotherly love and wanting to see them kind of, jump or whatever in surprise. So they were obviously surprised when Squish got squished, and that was basically the only show of force the Brook needed. They killed one Thup, and the Thup realized that seems really bad. Like a permanent end? We're an ageless race, like they'd never really had to comprehend death on that sort of scale before. Or at least murder, the fact that one person could just end another's life because you don't do what they say. It was a very foreign concept to the Thup. And they were, at this time, fairly easily subjugated. Glacia still, though, left the Frost Raiders behind, or at least a large wing of them, probably most of them, behind to occupy Thuppish territory in order to make sure that they would pay her tribute, and in order to also show them how to mine the mountains for tribute. So, this 500 years before Thup, being an avatar and a hero, he wasn't going to sit on his hands forever. He thought up a plan, and it was to expel Glacia. So as the Thuppish people were gathering gold for Glacia, near a lake called Lake Blatt, he caused an earthquake to knock all of the gold into the lake. The frost giants and the people didn't know what to do. Glacia noticed her tithe was short, so she flies down to investigate. Here's the story. So she freezes the entire lake and tells them to, now mine away at the ice to get the gold. At the bottom of the lake, though, they find this giant diamond. And Thup has placed this diamond there as a trick, and he's expelled it to be completely irresistible to Glacia. So she looks at this diamond. To everyone else, it just looks kind of like a big rock, but to her, it looks like the biggest, fanciest diamond in the whole world. But it's also too large, and it's expelled in some way, so it can't be moved. It's bound to the rock. So she starts the process of moving all of her riches from the north, from Barlack, to a new layer here at the bottom of this lake, at Castle Blatt. And I should say Lake Blatt, a new castle at Lake Blatt. She freezes over the lake, has a castle built on it, and then has it expanded into a palace in the intervening years. After that, Thup realizes, okay, she's mostly subdued. Like, she's not going to leave the diamond. She's not going to leave her palace. We have the Ice Palace. So he starts raising mountains around Castle Blatt, around this icy palace. And he starts covering it as well in a lake, a frozen lake that snows all the time. So it's this underground palace that's underneath a lake as well. And he just has a hole drilled in the surface. And his plan, literally as odd as it sounds, but I mean that's Thup for you, is we can just make gold and we can trade with people to make gold. As long as we can just keep putting gold in the hole and making the dragon happy, we won't have to worry about her squishing us. And we can also subjugate her people, corrupt their minds and weaken them over time, so that they want to just sit around and drink and have fun with us instead of war. We don't want war. We just want to sit around and have fun and drink. So it seems to be working, this hole-in-the-ground strategy, if you will. Glacia goes dormant. Thup creates an order called the Fargoers, from which Thubthol would found, and the Tholians would eventually come. So this is kind of like the prototype Tholians in Grand Covenant. But the Fargoers were established to form trade routes between different ancient capitals because they were very distant in the first era. Then from there, as steadily the Frost Giants and the Frost Raiders that were in Thuppish society integrated there, occupying the territory, over the course of time, by about 2000 First Era, so it's about 1500 years after Glacia's been put in the castle, Hill Giants, another race of Atheros, which we haven't really explored in Hanua yet, but we likely will at some point. But the Hill Giants started to appear, and they were basically an intermixing of the Brook and the Thup. They were able to integrate freely into both societies. They were welcome in Thuppish society, and they were also welcome in Brook society. They weren't necessarily seen as equals, as parts of the warrior tribe in Brook society, but they still understood, hey, we like to trade, and these Hill Giants, they're one of us. Not as cool of us, but they're still cousins from another tribe. So the Hill Giants form in 2000 First Era and integrate into both societies. And 500 years after that, some of the Frost Raider matriarchs, they see these Hill Giants as like a threat. Like, hey, whoa, they're going soft. They aren't standing for war and dominance and authority. If we keep going down this path, we're all going to become a bunch of navel gazers like the Thup. So 500 years after the Hill Giants start appearing, the Frost Raiders return to Barlack, and they start to impose martial law on their own society, on the Brook society up there in the north, in Glacia's absence. Basically saying, hey, Glacia's gone. She's been gone for 2,000 years now, but we notice that, y'all have been sitting up there getting a little fat without the dragon around. To change, we have to make sure that our people remain strong, even though Glacia is gone. So the Frost Raiders, they leave Thuppish territory. Like, the occupation is basically over, right? They return to Barlack. This is in 1500 First Era. So 4000 was when the first conflict, is what it's called, started. When Squish got squished. And 2500 years later, in 1500 First Era, that first conflict was finally officially over, right? Like 1,000 years before that, in 3500 First Era, Glacia had been expelled and interred more or less in the ground and wasn't a super big problem. They just had all the Frost Raiders walking around all over the place. Now they don't have Frost Raiders walking around all over the place. All the Thup need to do is maintain the hole in the ground strategy. Keep putting gold in the hole. It doesn't seem that difficult, right? So they've won. Like, Thup actually won. You didn't have this age-old conflict between the Giants and the Thup that's been going on for thousands of years. No, there was a period of peace because Thup actually won. He used his trickery and his intelligence and, just time and patience to win out over the other side. So this occurs in 1500 First Era. And the peace, continental peace, more or less continues. So for 1500 years, going up all the way to 02nd Era, there's no major conflicts, at least on this scale, where you have one group of people trying to dominate another. You have, some internal conflicts. Actually, no, I don't think the internal conflicts in the Grand Tier, those don't start until the Second Era. So yes, actually, this is pretty much an era of total peace, if you will. But that would end in 02nd Era. And I shouldn't say the total peace. Peace wouldn't end, but the total peace would end, at least. So the Silver Age would start to decay. And again, we'd start to see the signs of sides lining up as they're preparing themselves for the Glacian War that will start in another 1500 years. So, yeah. Basically about 3,000 years of war half of it's good, half of it's bad. 3,000 years of peace, half of it's good, half of it's bad. Cycle, at least in the example that we have here. All right, so peace in the 0-second era. Until then, it had, again, been a total peace. Everyone was happy where they were. All of the ancient races were just kind of doing their own thing, trading with each other, minor conflicts, but nothing major. But then in the 0-second era, the Karlach emerged. And it is this great psychic entity that takes the form of a miasma. And any creature, living or dead, that's left in the miasma for too long can become a servant to the Karlach. And the more of these servants it has, especially the more advanced their minds are, the more intelligent these individual puppets can become. So it's kind of like a hive mind of these little zombie flesh puppets within a certain radius. The more of them there are in a certain radius, the more intelligent they become and the more advanced their tactics become. Brooke believe that it was a curse, or at least some Brooke believe, that it was a curse for digging too deep into Mount Barlac, searching for more than they needed to simply appease Glacia. They got too greedy, they wanted more for themselves, they dug too deep, and as a result, this miasma was released from the heart of Herma, from the heart of Barlac, and they called it the Karlach. It pushed the Brooke out of Mount Hadrone, their home, their native land, and into the plains. The plains just kind of northeast of the hills of Mork and Gork there. So I guess it would be the northwestern Horseshoe Plains. So they're displaced from their lands, and, with nothing else to do, they can't mine and maintain their society that way anymore. But, hey, they still have all those talents and skills from the Frost Raiders have been passed down. So they advance themselves in guerrilla warfare. They kind of change up their tactics a bit, and they start to raid villagers, travelers, supply wagons, pretty much anything that they can find in the Horseshoe Plains, just using these lightning tactics to appear from out of nowhere when no one would ever expect it. Raid a village, take a bunch of people, take a bunch of goods, be gone in 5 minutes before a defense can even be mounted, and then be riding off over the hillside before sunset. Like, just hit and then gone. Hit and run. But they still retained a lot of their native culture that they had in Barlac, just in war camps. Those war camps would kind of rotate around the hills in kind of a nomadic fashion according to the season. So that, again, you have this displacement of the Brooke. They were doing their own thing. Now they've been turned into raiders because their home mountain has been destroyed. Thubthol no longer... or I should say, Thubthol, at the same time, appears as part of the Fargoers who were established initially. As they are going around expanding trade with the world, he wants to do not only that, trade, but also bring more. He wants to share Thuppish brewing with the world, and Thuppish magic with the world, and Thuppish knowledge and Thuppish peace with the rest of the world. So you have around this time as well Thubthol forming the Thullians, and they start to more or less spread this doctrine of Thup, right? This doctrine of goodness and magic and knowledge and brewing. They start to spread that to the world. So at the same time, you have both of these cultures spreading out again. This continued this way about 500 years until here we go. So Thubthol and the Thullians, they become a race 200 years, or sorry, I think just 100 years later. And they start to really ingrain themselves into Atherosian society. You also see in the east about 500 years later, skipping forward a bit here, so the Frost Raiders have been raiding for another 500 years. the Tholians have been trading and spreading Thuppish knowledge and culture for 500 years. And that's when we see the Ikaika start to spread in the east as well. So we have these two Western cultures spreading. Now the Ikaika are spreading Kane's culture in the east from the islands to the continent. And we have this intermingling of those cultures. Meanwhile, also in the east, at the same time, at 600 Second Era, Revax, still the Lich King of the Serpent People, rises in the Apan. He leads the Serpent People in a genocide of the Ator. He kills 60% of the Ator population, and the rest escaped with their lives. And Nagamesh, the avatar that creates them, also flees into the earth and stops making more. So the Ator population is not only what would that be? Hexamated? It's not only hexamated, but they also can't make any more now because their avatar is missing, nowhere to be found. And that's how New Ator made the Nagamesh, the Life Spitter, just spits them out. There you go. So you had the Ikaika spreading in the east, spreading Kane's culture, Kane's love. There's a lore chat all about the Vahi up on the channel if you want to hear more about that. But you also have at the same time evil rising in the east too. So within a 500-year span, you have in the west, kind of again those conquerors, that evil sort of side rising in the Frost Raiders, the good rising in the Tholians. And you have the good rising in the Ikaika in the east, but then you also have the evil rising in the form of Revax. So again, as we're talking about the war, and as we're talking about how it's really about that conflict between imposed order of one person's will over another versus the natural order of self-governance and self-determination, we're thinking about here, these are the powers that are starting to rise, and they can already see each other as potential conflicts. They're already starting to circle each other, thinking war might break out at any time. So as you're kind of reading, or rather, as you're listening to this and reading through the histories too, if you're doing that, keep in mind that Thup and the Tholian mission and the Ikaika, they assumed that war could break out at any moment. But meanwhile, Revax and the Empire and the Frost Raiders, they're usually just kind of participating in this brinksmanship, continue to try to take more and more and more by strength and influence and threat, and then go to war to take what they need to when that runs out. So that happens in 600 Second Era. You also have, within the Thup now, shifting back over to the west, between about 6 and 800 Second Era, the Thup see Revax's rise in the east, and they know the Frost Raiders are still around too. They're feeling pretty threatened that, an assault could come from two sides. What if somehow the Frost Raiders and Revax were to team up, right? That would be disastrous. So Thup, the people, they create the Tharg, and they are a magically created warrior caste. They're created from the earth of Mount Gomrin, and they are advanced as well in skillet arms. And then they're widely integrated into Thuppish society. So, all right, you guys go over to this city, you all go over to this city, they're still a caste, so they really only marry within the Tharg, but regardless, they are spread throughout the different cities and they live, in the same neighborhoods as everybody else. It won't be until a little bit later that we see the Tharg become kind of like a little bit of a separate entity. In addition to that, the Thup also enchant their borders with illusions and fey creatures. So I know a lot of people have looked at, making a variant human and getting the fey touched or the shadow touched feat right off the bat. Making a variant human that's like a Koolander from around the Mupped Up Forest or the Dopton Forest. If you've got one of those variant feats, it's a great way to do it. All right, but shifting now back to the history here. So yeah, in 800 second era, 600 second era, in that window there, you also see the Thup enchanting their border forests with different illusions and fey creatures in order to keep themselves safe from a future attack by the Frost. Have also in this window on the Nator side, on Revax's side, they've started to enslave the Izran to their east in the Shastani Mountains. So they've started to expand their slaving network even further than it was before. This raises the ire finally. It finally reaches a point where Kane, the god of the Vahe to the east, grows fed up with it. He's been actually nurturing a relationship with Makua, the kind of like the true neutral patron god up at Mount Everor. So much so that she's actually kind of switching her alignment at this point to neutral good. So he and Makua are growing quite distasteful with with all the slaving, basically, the enslavement they're seeing of the Izrans in the Alpine rainforest. And the Tholian mission, too, they are also equally growing fed up with it. And so you see all three forces, Kane, who's the avatar of the Vahi, Makua, who's a neutral avatar who doesn't really get much screen time. At least we don't talk about her much, but she's pretty important. And the Tholian mission, who are kind of representatives of Thup. They all raise armies, all three of them, to fight the Nator slave trade. They don't go strike out just yet, but they're readying themselves, right? So we see from 900 to 1000 second era, those three forces formed by the Tholian mission, Kane, and Makua. But before they can strike out against the serpents, before they can go and manifest destiny, in 1000 second era, so just after they form all these armies, the Karlach, which once came and destroyed Mount Hadron and pushed the Brook out of their home, now it appears in the city of Kanev. It destroys the city of Kanev in 2 days and the surrounding region in about a month. Axis is utterly set back by this. It's a much larger setback than he is ever willing to let on. But it diminishes his power in such a large way that he's unable to really participate effectively in any of the diplomacy or kind of military posturing that takes place in the immediate future following the fall of the Karlach. But the Karlach doesn't just destroy Khan, it also corrupts the cities of Loskar and Prot. So at this time, an allied council forms, and this is kind of the first, I guess, blueprint that you'll see of the alliance that will eventually form against Glacia, right? This one's a little bit wider because there are some forces that stand for authority here, but ultimately, I mean, this is probably the widest alliance that we ever see in the history of Atheros, is when we have the Maul, the Make Atheros Whole League, form in order to stop the Karlach in the wake of the destruction of Loskar and Prot around the year 1000. So for the next 400 years, those armies that were raised on both sides, and the avatars, they commit all of their might to fighting the Karlach and purifying the land. And, a lot of them suffer a lot. They'll suffer a lot of casualties, economic loss, as well as the loss of life. And the loss of traditions, culture, military traditions as well. Those 400 years are, again, this is an era of peace, but I'm still considering it an era of peace when we're considering the point of, or at least the definition of this war, to be the conflict between the self-governance and the self-determination of the peoples here. The Karlach is like an extra-dimensional psychic entity, right? I mean, it's almost on... It's threatening even than Glacia, right? Like, at least with Glacia, you have some semblance of free will and the ability to rebel at some point, and you have, still some self-determination. But as the Karlach, you are just an utter puppet. Like, any sense of yourself and independence is just destroyed. So yeah, even the baddies didn't like the idea of the Karlach continuing to reign. It had already destroyed and corrupted four of the great ancient cities of the First Era. They had to, but it didn't go down easy. It took them 400 years, from about 1000 Second Era to about 1400 Second Era, to actually put down the Karlach and to fully purify the land. Once this is done, the aftermath, what are we looking at here? Well, there's a group of Thup called, well, I won't name them just yet, but the vast majority of the Thup, 80%, and that is not an exaggeration according to the histories here, feel that Atheros has fallen into decay. That there's not really anything left of the heart of Atheros. Like, first, there was the first conflict with Glacia. Now there's been this terrible war with the Karlach. One of the conditions of the victory being that they have to erase and scrub away a lot of their ancient knowledge. They don't like this idea. The Thup really like knowledge, and they like ancient knowledge even more. Like preserving that ancient knowledge most. So a lot of the Thup weren't on the idea. And they formed what are called the Exodites. They, kind of like the elves of the Lord of the Rings, they left Atheros, 80% of them. They just took their knowledge, they took their learnings, they said, you know what, this world is doomed for death and destruction. We're going to go wander the plains, we're going to go see if we can recapture that halcyon peace and beauty that we had back in the Golden Age, when we didn't have fear, when we didn't have death, when we didn't have debt, when we didn't have oppression. We're escaping all of this, we're leaving. Goodbye, Atheros. And the Exodites just left. That was it. 80% of the Thup just walk out. And Thup goes too. He goes also to explore. He still comes back to Atheros every now and again, but it's always in a new form, right? Take the form of a meteor or a cloud. He never really takes that humanoid Thup form again. Thup 2 is just gone. Only, or at least his body, only his spirit remains. So around 1400, between 1400 and 1500, the Exodites, they leave the realm. They're just fed up with it. Looking now at Revax, how he fared, he did not do so well. Again, one of his major cities, Kanev, got utterly destroyed by the Karlach. So with his power diminished, and also, trying to legitimize and normalize slavery abroad, because that's a big part of the Serpent economy. They used to be slaves to the Ator. They inherited that culture, and they didn't change much about it, even as social decay has led it to kind of at times collapse in on itself. Revax always finds another brutal dictatorial way to, fix the problem. Let's put it that way. So in order to fix the problem right now of the diminished Serpent economy and of the diminished Serpent influence abroad, he forms an order called the Ironhearts. And the idea of the Ironhearts is, one, to try to control as much of the iron veins around the continent as they can, in order to basically give them an upper edge in trade. Like, okay, everyone else can have their different commodity. You have the coconut, you have the pig, whatever. After these 400 years of war, we know what the real commodity is. It's iron, besides just magic. So Revax expands a little bit and creates this trade organization called the Ironhearts. And they do act pretty independently of him. And he wants to keep it that way. He doesn't want the Ironhearts to look like a Serpent Person organization and be treated abroad that way. No, it's supposed to be a cooperative trade venture between all who don't want to see their freedoms infringed upon. You know, we've been trading these goods for thousands of years for you to come into my lands and to tread on my cultural heritage. Again, like, these are not the good guys, right? I'm not condoning this sort of behavior. This is just how they excuse it. So as the Ironhearts start to rise and increase in trade throughout the continent, the Tholian mission, which again formed kind of in the shadow of Thub Thul, and to spread the good of Thup everywhere, they just plainly say, we are excommunicating anyone. So if you trade with the Ironhearts, you're excommunicated. That's it. So 1400 Second Era, again, like the war with the Karlach is only just over. The dust is settling. Revax is creating a trade organization to normalize slavery and to try to control this flow of iron on the continent. And the Tholian mission excommunicates anybody who deals with that new trade organization. So that right there, boom, we can see the peace, again, another fracture in it forming over time. Glacia isn't even here right now, but we can see that echo of authoritarianism going on into the future here. Tholian mission founded to stand against her once before, now standing against Revax, and honestly keeping itself strong and relevant in doing so. In this time, you also have another race rising, perhaps the most influential race in the Third Era, in the time of Atheros to come. Certainly one of the most populous at this point. Those are the Freelanders, or the Jinn, the humans, the ones who fled the Grantier Peninsula. So Veshta hadn't really committed many forces to the whole Karlach uprising thing. She made a wall and committed a small defense force, but didn't actually suffer many losses. She had other things going on in her land at the time, such as human sacrifice being committed by her brother. So a lot of the humans that had been welling up in the peninsula there, as the other powers around Atheros were depleted again in people because of the war, the humans, they had more. And a lot of them wanted to try to escape the Grantier Peninsula. It would be madness to try to overthrow Veshta. That was stupid. Like, they weren't that dumb. She still had control of the not the monarchy. She still had control of the nobility and the aristocracy. There's just no way that they could overthrow her, but they could at least escape her reign. So these Freelanders, these proto-humans, they escape into the Grantier Mountains, and then they escape further into the Northern Horseshoe Plains. And they start to settle that area, along with some Veshtan refugees as well. It's not like they're 100% humans. There's some Veshtans who had hearts or who were cheated by Veshta, and they're like, I'm out of here. I'm joining with the humans. So you have here, kind of between 1400 and 1500, the Freelanders, or the proto-humans, starting to settle the Northern Horseshoe Plains. And again, like, they will become a dominant force, whether they like it or not, in the coming war. Just because Veshta and Glacia both see the humans as a chip. Like, they are the biggest chip on the board, right? Whoever controls the humans controls the Horseshoe Plains. Whoever controls the Horseshoe Plains controls Atheros. So it might seem here like, okay, the Freelanders fleeing the Grantier and settling the Northern Horseshoe Plains, what does that have to do with the war? It is imperative. It's imperative to the war. So this continues for about 100 years or so. The battle lines are being dotted, not drawn. But remember, we had just recently a bunch of the Exodites leave. So fast forward to 1500 Second Era, right? 80% of the Thup just left, including a lot of people that had the great magical secrets that they didn't want to give up, right? And a lot of the other great magical secrets have been given up. They've been erased or forgotten, right? So, remember, hole in the ground strategy? The Thup are no longer capable of just magically creating enough gold and riches to throw in the hole. And they're no longer politically aligned, well, at least with another of the largest trade organizations on the continent. And they're also not well politically aligned with the Frost Raiders either. So, they have no gold. And the tale is that a bedraggled Tharg ran into the Thargish king's courtroom saying, "Gold reserves are dangerously low!" He didn't say it, he shouted it. And then he collapsed into a disheveled heap. And so at this point, the Tharg, or at least Thargish representatives from around the Thuplands, were at an impasse, right? They knew the tale. They knew what would happen if they stopped putting gold in the hole. Glacia, that mad dragon, would rise again. The Tharg knew they were created to protect the Thuppish people, and the Tholian too, of course, from external threats, from forces, evil like Glacia. And they were pretty split down the middle. Half of the race wanted to continue to kind of like dogmatically guard the Thuplands integrated into wider Thuppish society, right? Like, okay, we've got this little group here, we've got this little group here, we've got this house there, this house there, this house here. But there was a young Thargish captain who would later become an avatar named Carden Rourke. And he, with fiery passion, proposed instead that the Tharg abandoned their posts across the Thuplands. And that instead, at the foot of the holy mountain, whose earth is their flesh, they create a great fortress stronghold, a city, in order to defend themselves against Glacia when she rose. That the only way to stop her was to move first, was to have that linchpin defense fortress in place. So if she wanted to invade the Thuplands, first she would have to go through Rourkehold. And she wasn't going to get through Rourkehold. So there you go. There was a lot of debate that followed in the High Council, but eventually they decided that Rourke's words were wise, and they, in fact, named the fortress city after him. They named it Rourkehold. And they built it there at the base of Gomrin, the Holy Mountain. So you have like this, the presence of Rourkehold cannot be understated, because like this really was a prescient decision by the Tharg. If not for that city, when Glacia awoke, she would have just swept into that area of the Covenant as well, and it would not have been, well, what would become the Covenant. It would not have been long before they were all just absorbed and done with. But this decision to create Rourkehold there really helped to fend off the Glacian forces before they were ever even launched, right? Like, they're just a less attractive target now. Go hit the humans on the Horseshoe Plains. Go hit anybody else. Just, we are not an attractive target, right? That was the goal. The Akaika, they also hear the tales, and they can see the writing on the wall. They start recruiting more widely from all races now. The Akaika, they were founded as an order of priests to Kane to spread his fiery love and his song of creation across the land. But they'd kind of become pseudo-abolitionists in the fight against Revax and his enslavement of the Izran. And now hearing, and of course against the Frost Raiders, and now hearing that Glacia could rise again, the Akaika kind of kick things into overdrive, and they start saying, you know what, not just Vahi, anybody can join our army. And that's when they really start to shift more from an order of priests to the private military organization that we know today. And that is where part 1 ends. Very shortly here, in 1600, we're going to have Glacia waking, consolidating her power, and then reclaiming her imperial dominion over all of Atheros. So as we're thinking about, okay, that happens, we already can see the battle lines that have been drawn, right? We know that the Tholian mission and what remains of the Thup and the Tharg and the Vahi and the Ikaika, they're kind of forming this pseudo southeastern alliance, right? In order to stand, that has stood so far against Revax, at least before the Karlach and everything and the Great Erasure. But now they're pivoting and they're saying, all right, Glacia is about to again. We need to get ready for this. But as they'll soon find, there is no way that you can get ready for Glacia. Yeah. So that is where we leave part 1 on the war. We talked about the meaning of the war. We talked about the first conflict. And then we talked about that tenuous peace between 0 and 1600 second era, where we could kind of see the battle lines being drawn and each side participating a little bit in that military and political brinksmanship. So, are there any questions before we end it for the day? And keep the questions, too, to just things that are happening so far in the war. If you have questions about something that might happen, save that for next week. All right, it doesn't sound like there's anything, but if you do think of a question, feel free to shoot me a message, and I would be more than happy to answer it. Or just ping me in questions and I'll get to you there. Anyways, I hope you all have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye, and get lots of 20s.